I shot Bigfoot, and what I filmed stunned scientists everywhere. I wasn't supposed to tell this story. 5 years ago, I signed federal papers that should have kept me quiet forever. But after those drone videos from the Kalmiopsis went viral last week, and the attacks on my reputation, the emails calling me everything from a fraud to a coward, I can't stay silent anymore. I'm a wildlife biologist, 22 years documenting large mammals across the Pacific Northwest. The kind of scientist who rolls his eyes at Bigfoot hunters. I need you to understand that before you hear what comes next. In October 2019, I headed 40 miles into Oregon's roughest wilderness for a routine elk survey. That's when my trail cameras started recording the impossible. One camera turned completely backwards while still locked in its bear-proof case. 19-inch footprints with toes that gripped soil like fingers. Trees bent into shelters. Stone tools arranged in caves like someone's home. On day 4, deep in Devil's Creek Canyon, I saw it. 8 feet tall, covered in auburn hair, carrying what looked like a carved staff. Around its neck, a wooden pendant. It wasn't attacking. Maybe it was trying to communicate. But in that split second of terror, I raised my grandfather's rifle and pulled the trigger. The scream it made was almost human. What happened next, the blood samples, the federal cover-up, the family of creatures that let me leave alive has haunted me ever since. Now dozens of hunters are flooding into the Kalmiopsis, and these creatures aren't hiding anymore. What happens when the beings we've been hunting decide to hunt back? My name is Marcus Holbrook. Until recently, I was a respected wildlife biologist with Oregon State University. Peer-reviewed papers on elk migration patterns. A reputation built on methodical fieldwork and conservative conclusions. If you don't know the Kalmiopsis wilderness, imagine 180,000 acres of the roughest country in Oregon, ancient rocks, forests so thick the sun barely touches the ground, valleys that swallow radio signals, the kind of place where a dozen hikers vanish every decade and their bodies are never found. I'd been putting off this particular survey grid for 3 years, 40 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by game trails that would humble a mountain goat. But the department needed data from that sector, and I was the only one stupid enough or experienced enough to go in alone. The morning I left Eugene, I kissed my wife goodbye and loaded my truck with the usual gear. Trail cameras, casting plaster, collection vials, emergency beacon, 2 weeks of freeze-dried food, always pack extra in the Kalmiopsis, water purification tablets, first aid kit, GPS with backup batteries, topo maps in waterproof sleeves, and my grandfather's .30-06 rifle. Grandpa's Winchester had accompanied me on every backcountry survey since he passed in 2018. He'd carried it through these same mountains for 60 years, back when he worked for the Forest Service. Toward the end, when the dementia got bad, he'd grab my arm with surprising strength and whisper about the tall men he'd seen in the deep valleys. "They watch us, Marcus," he'd say, his eyes sharp despite the confusion that clouded everything else. Been watching since before we knew to look back. I'd written it off as mountain folklore mixed with mental decline. Wished I'd listened closer. That morning, I also strapped on something new, a body camera I'd bought to record field techniques for my graduate students. Little black box clipped to my pack strap, 4K resolution, 12-hour battery life. If I hadn't been wearing it, no one would believe what happened. Hell, sometimes I watch the footage and I still don't believe it myself. The drive to the trailhead took 4 hours, 2 on paved roads, 2 more on Forest Service tracks that threatened to shake my truck apart. I parked at the rusted gate that marks the wilderness. Boundary. That last threshold between our world and theirs. Though I didn't think of it that way then. The pack weighed 65 pounds when I shouldered it. Too much for a man pushing 50. But I'd rather suffer the weight than run short of supplies out there. The first steps into the tree line felt like entering a cathedral. Douglas firs older than the United States, their trunks wider than my truck, creating a pillared darkness even at noon. I had 11 trail cameras to deploy across a 15-square-mile grid, each one positioned to capture elk movement patterns at key terrain features, ridge saddles, water sources, bedding areas. Standard wildlife biology. Nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. But standing at that threshold, adjusting my pack straps while the forest breathed its ancient air around me, something felt different. Not wrong, exactly, just observed. Like the trees themselves were taking note of my arrival. I touched the compass hanging from my grandfather's rifle, his old brass one that he'd carried since Korea, and stepped into the wilderness. I had no idea I was walking into their territory, or that they'd been expecting me. The first 2 days went exactly as planned, which should have been my warning. In my experience, nothing ever goes smoothly in the Kalmiopsis. I made good time despite the terrain, covering 8 miles that first day through old-growth forest that hadn't seen a chainsaw since before World War II. The GPS tracked my progress as I installed cameras at predetermined waypoints, each unit locked in a bear-proof case, positioned at elk shoulder height, tested twice before I moved on. I recorded detailed notes on my phone. Camera 3, ridge saddle at 4,200 feet elevation, 42.1397 degrees north, 123.9856 degrees west, facing north toward primary game trail. Fresh elk scat within 20 meters, mountain lion scrape on nearby Douglas fir. That first night, I pitched my tent near BIGFOOT Creek, one of those ice-cold streams that run. Clear even in October, the sound should have been constant water over rocks, the white noise of wilderness that usually helps me sleep. But it kept cutting out, these moments of absolute silence that made me sit up in my sleeping bag, listening, not quiet, silent. The difference matters. Quiet is the absence of loud sounds. Silence is the presence of nothing, like the forest itself is holding its breath. The second morning brought fog thick enough to muffle sound and cut visibility to maybe 30 feet. I worked by compass and GPS, trusting technology and experience over instinct. Camera 4 went up near an elk wallow that reeked of musk and ammonia. Camera 5 overlooked a narrow meadow where Roosevelt elk had worn trails like highway systems through the bare grass. But I kept finding things that didn't fit the pattern. Game trails that simply stopped mid-slope, as if the elk had walked into solid air. Places where the underbrush grew so thick it formed walls, but with gaps near the ground like tunnels. A grove of young alders bent and woven into shapes that reminded me of my daughter's kindergarten art projects, deliberate but inexplicable. My scientific brain worked overtime trying to explain it. Wind damage, disease, some unusual growth pattern caused by the unique geology. The Kalmiopsis has serpentine soils that create botanical oddities, carnivorous pitcher plants, species found nowhere else on Earth. Why not weird tree formations? That second evening, I set up camp in a small basin protected by a semicircle of ancient cedars. The spot felt secure, sheltered. I cooked my freeze-dried beef stroganoff on my camp stove, made notes about the day's observations, cleaned my equipment, normal routine, except for the knocking. It started around 9 p.m., according to my field notes. A hollow thok sound, like someone hitting a baseball bat against a tree. Then an answer from the opposite side of the basin, maybe 200 yards away. Then a third, forming a triangle with my camp at the center. Pileated woodpeckers, I told myself. Except pileated woodpeckers don't drum at night, and they don't answer each other in patterns. Thok, pause. Thok, thok, pause. Thok, thok, thok. I turned on my audio recorder, the good one I use for documenting elk bugles. The knocking continued for 23 minutes, I know, because I time-stamped the recording. Sometimes rapid-fire bursts, like Morse code. Sometimes single knocks with long gaps between, as if waiting for responses. The pattern suggested communication, but between what? When it finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than before. I lay in my tent with the rifle beside me, though I felt foolish about it. 20 years in the wilderness, and I'd never needed it for anything but putting down injured animals. But something about those knocks, the deliberate intelligence behind them, made my hindbrain scream warnings my rational mind couldn't parse. Around 2 a.m., I woke to footsteps, soft but distinct, circling the tent at maybe 50 feet. Not the random movement of a foraging bear or the quick steps of deer. Deliberate, bipedal. The stride pattern was wrong for human gait too long, with an unusual rhythm that suggested a different kind of locomotion. I held my breath, hand finding the rifle stock, as whatever it was completed 3 circuits of my camp. Then nothing. Just the sound of BIGFOOT Creek suddenly resuming, as if someone had unmuted the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I found no tracks, no disturbed ground. Only my cameras would later reveal the truth of what had stood there in the darkness, studying my tent with eyes that reflected green in the infrared flash. But I wouldn't know that until much later. On the morning of day 3, I just packed up and continued deeper into the wilderness, telling myself I was a scientist, not some paranoid hunter jumping at shadows. Day 3 started wrong. You know that feeling when you wake up and the birds aren't singing? Not silent like the night before, just absent, like they'd all decided to be somewhere else. I broke camp at first light, heading toward Camera 6, the furthest point in my survey grid. The GPS showed 4 miles through old growth, mostly downhill toward Rough and Ready Creek. Should have been an easy morning hike. The trail, if you could call a deer path, barely wide enough for my shoulders, a trail wound through a grove of Port Orford cedars that had to be 500 years old. Their bark ran with morning condensation that looked like sweat. Everything dripped in the Kalmiopsis, even when it hadn't rained. The canopy held moisture like a sponge, releasing it in random drops that always seemed to find the gap between your collar and neck. Camera 6 was exactly where I'd placed it 36 hours earlier, locked in its bear-proof case on a Douglas fir about 12 feet from a well-worn game trail. The Elk Highway, I'd called it in my notes. Fresh tracks, fresh scat, rubs on 3 different trees, textbook ungulate behavior. Except the camera was facing the wrong direction, not knocked askew, not tilted by a curious bear or bumped by a passing elk. Deliberately turned 180 degrees to face the tree trunk. The security lock was still engaged, the metal case unopened. But something, had unscrewed the mounting bracket, rotated the entire unit, and carefully screwed it back in place. My hands started doing that thing they do when my rational brain and my instinct disagree. They got busy with unnecessary tasks while I tried to process what I was seeing. I checked my GPS twice, verified the camera serial number against my field notes, took photographs from multiple angles, all displacement activity, what animals do when they're stressed. Funny how 20 years of studying animal behavior doesn't exempt you from exhibiting it yourself. The memory card was balanced on top of the camera case, not dropped, not wedged somewhere. Random. Balanced, like a calling card. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at it. 43 miles from the nearest road. Elevation 3,847 feet. No human footprints in the soft earth around the tree. The nearest prints of any kind were elk tracks 20 feet away. But there were impressions, depressions in the duff that didn't match any track pattern I knew. Too degraded to cast, but suggesting something heavy had stood here. Something bipedal, based on the spacing. The stride length was wrong, though maybe 4 feet between steps. I'm 6'1" and my stride is about 30 inches. Whatever made these impressions was either doing lunges or stood significantly taller than me. I retrieved the memory card with hands that weren't quite steady, sliding it into my tablet to review. The last image timestamp was 11:47 p.m. the previous night. A young bull elk, probably a spike, passing through the frame. Then, nothing. The card should have had another 12 hours of capacity, but it stopped recording right after that elk. I replaced it with a fresh card and repositioned the camera, but something made me deploy one of my backup units too. I mounted it on a tree 30 yards away with a clear view of the first camera. If something came back, I'd have footage of it approaching. The hike back to camp took 3 hours, though it should have taken 2. I kept stopping, listening, checking my 6. That feeling of being observed had intensified from background anxiety to active certainty. You know how your neck hair stands up when someone's staring at you across a room? Imagine that feeling, but the room is 40,000 acres of wilderness. I made it back to my base camp by early afternoon. Spent 2 hours reviewing all my notes, checking the other cameras via their wireless signals, the ones that were still transmitting, trying to find a logical explanation. Another researcher? Possible, but why the elaborate game? A poacher? They'd have destroyed the camera, not played with it. Local kids pulling pranks? The nearest local kids were in Cave Junction, 50 miles away. My grandfather would have known what it meant. Toward the end, when the dementia had him more often than not, he'd still have these moments of perfect clarity. Usually when we were talking about the woods. They test you first, he told me once, gripping my hand hard enough to hurt. See what kind of man you are, whether you're a threat, whether you're worthy of their attention. I'd written it off as folklore mixed with dying neurons. Mountain men have been telling Bigfoot stories since before Oregon was a state. Every hunting camp has that one guy who swears he saw something. But sitting there in my tent, staring at that memory card balanced so precisely on my camera, I started wondering if Grandpa's stories were more testimony than tale. That night, I didn't light my camp stove. Ate a cold MRE in my tent with a rifle loaded beside me. The forest stayed quiet, not the oppressive silence of the night before, just normal quiet. Somehow that was worse. Like whatever was out there had finished its assessment and moved on to the next phase. I didn't sleep much. Just lay there, listening to my own breathing, wondering what kind of intelligence could unscrew a camera mount in the dark and why it would want me to know it could. I need you to understand something about my mental state on the morning of day 4. I'd slept maybe 6 hours total in 3 nights. I'd been eating military rations and filtering creek water that tasted like copper and dead leaves. My scientific objectivity was fighting a losing battle against something older, the part of your brain that kept your ancestors alive when they were prey. But I was still a biologist, still trained to observe, document, hypothesize. So when I found the first structure, I approached it like I would any unknown phenomenon, with curiosity tempered by caution. It was maybe 200 yards from where camera 6 had been tampered with. I'd decided to do a thorough grid search of the area, looking for tracks, scat, hair samples, anything that might explain the disturbance. What I found instead changed everything. At first, I thought it was storm damage. A cluster of young alders bent at unnatural angles, their crowns twisted together about 8 feet off the ground. But as I got closer, I could see the pattern. The trees hadn't been broken by wind or snow load. They'd been woven. 3 alders, each about 4 inches in diameter, had been pulled together while they were still alive and flexible, their branches intertwined in a pattern that looked random from one angle and deliberate from another. Like those magic eye pictures that were popular in the 90 seconds chaos until your brain suddenly recognizes the design, I spent 20 minutes photographing it from every angle. Measuring the height, 8.3 feet at the apex, the diameter of the enclosed space, roughly 6 feet, the precise angles of the bends. The trees were still alive, their leaves green and healthy despite the manipulation. Based on the healing around the bend points, I estimated they'd been shaped at least 2 seasons ago. The second structure was 50 yards northeast, and it stopped me cold. If the first one could have been a freak accident of nature, this one couldn't. 7 trees, a mix of alder and vine maple, formed a dome about 12 feet across. The trunks had been bent when young and were now growing in engineered curves. Smaller branches were woven between them in a pattern that reminded me of basket weaving, if baskets were made by something with incredible strength and an alien sense of aesthetics. Inside, the ground was different. Compressed, cleared of debris, and in the center, arrangement of bones that made my mouth go dry. Deer bones, mostly. Some elk. A few I couldn't immediately identify. But they weren't scattered like the remains of a predator's meal. They were placed, organized by size and type. Long bones radiating out from a central point where skulls of various sizes were nested inside each other like Russian dolls. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and hike out. But the scientist in me, the part that had spent 2 decades trying to understand the natural world, couldn't walk away from this. I photographed everything, took measurements, made detailed sketches in my waterproof notebook, even collected a few of the smaller bones for later analysis. The third structure was the one that really shook me. It wasn't made from bent trees, but from materials that had been brought there. Branches of uniform thickness, each about 6 feet long, leaned against a natural depression in a rock face. The branches were from different tree species, Douglas fir, cedar, hemlock, but all cut to the same length. Not broken, cut. The ends showed clear compression marks, like something had bitten through them with massive jaws. But what jaws? No bear or cougar could bite cleanly through a 4-inch branch, and the bite radius suggested a jaw much larger than any predator in Oregon. Inside this lean-to structure, I found the tools. That's the only word for them. 3 stones that had been clearly shaped, napped like primitive arrowheads, but much larger. One appeared to be a hand axe, its edge still sharp enough to cut paper. Another might have been a scraping tool. The third I couldn't identify, but it had been worked extensively, shaped for some specific purpose. Beside them, a piece of antler that had been actually carved into something that might have been decorative or might have been functional. The marks were deliberate, creating a pattern of parallel lines and crescents that meant nothing to me but clearly meant something to whoever made it. My body camera recorded my whispered commentary. This is, I don't. These are tools. Primitive, but undeniably manufactured tools. The implications are, Christ, what am I looking at here? I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking, the same thing my colleagues would think, the same thing I would have thought a week earlier. But I held those tools, felt their weight, ran my finger along edges shaped by intelligence. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was already dropping behind the western ridge. I'd covered maybe half a square mile and found 7 distinct structures, each one more elaborate than the last. My memory cards were full of images that would either revolutionize anthropology or destroy my career. I sat in my tent, transferring files to my backup drives, my hands shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Outside, the forest had gone quiet again. Not the oppressive silence of before, but something watchful, expectant. I think they wanted me to find those structures, wanted me to understand that I wasn't dealing with animals. The tampered camera had been an invitation, and I'd accepted it. That night, they accepted mine. I woke at 4:17 a.m. on day 4 to the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. Not whined through the trees, not the wheeze of a bear sniffing around camp. Breathing, deep, measured inhalations and exhalations coming from somewhere outside my tent, close. Maybe 10 feet from where I lay, frozen in my sleeping bag, hands slowly reaching for the rifle. The breathing circled my tent, counterclockwise. 3 complete circuits, pausing occasionally as if examining something. My equipment cases. My boots left outside to air out. The cold fire pit where I'd cooked dinner 8 hours earlier. Then, footsteps, heavy enough to compress the pine needle duff with audible crunches. The stride was all wrong, too long for a human, too regular for a bear. About 4 feet between steps, which would put whatever was walking at well over 7 feet tall. I held my breath until my lungs burned. Kept my hand on the rifle but didn't chamber a round. The metallic click would have been like a gunshot in that silence. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent. Through the thin nylon, I could sense mass, presence, something large enough to block out the faint starlight filtering through the trees. The breathing continued, now with a slight wheeze on the exhale, like air moving through a larger nasal cavity than any human possessed. My body camera was in my pack, recording nothing. My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't dare move to reach it. For 3 minutes, I counted the seconds we existed in that suspended moment. It outside, me inside, both aware of the other. Then it spoke. Not words, not exactly. A low, rumbling vocalization that started in the chest and rolled up through the throat. It had cadence, rhythm, the rise and fall of attempted communication. Like listening to someone speak underwater, you know there's meaning, but you can't parse it. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then silence. Then footsteps moving away, back into the forest, until even my trained ears couldn't track them anymore. I didn't move until dawn painted the tent walls orange. Didn't breathe normally until I could hear birds again, a few brave Steller's jays announcing the morning. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, my legs shook like I'd run a marathon. The tracks were everywhere, 19 inches long, 5 toes clearly visible. The ball of the foot deeper than the heel, suggesting a different weight distribution than human locomotion. The mid-tarsal break, that flexibility in the middle of the foot that humans lost when we came down from the trees, was obvious in every print. But it was the pattern that made me sit down hard on a log, staring. The tracks circled my tent 3 times, just as I'd heard, but they also went to each of my equipment cases, paused, then moved on without disturbing anything. Whatever made them had examined my gear through the cases. Studied my boots, one track directly in front of them, toes pointing straight at the laces, as if considering the construction. Checked the cold fire pit, circling it once. This wasn't a bear looking for food. Wasn't a curious cougar. This was investigation. Intelligence gathering. I photographed everything with shaking hands. Used my tape measure for scale. The big toe alone was nearly 3 inches long. The stride length varied between 48 and 52 inches. To put that in perspective, I'm 6'1" and my stride is about 30 inches. Olympic sprinters might hit 45 inches at full speed. This thing's walking pace was longer than a human's run. I mixed plaster in my cooking pot, contaminating it for food, but I didn't care and cast the clearest print. While it set, I noticed something else. My grandfather's compass, which I'd left hanging on a tree branch, had been moved, not knocked down, moved. Rehung on a different branch, 3 feet higher, facing the opposite direction. The message was clear. I see your tools. I understand what they do. I can manipulate your environment at will. By full daylight, I documented 16 individual prints, plus several partial impressions where it had stood on harder ground. My hands had finally stopped shaking. replaced by something else. Not fear, exactly. More like the feeling you get when you realize you've been swimming in the ocean and something large just brushed your leg. That recalculation of your place in the food chain. I should have packed up right then. Should have hiked out, driven home, forgotten the whole thing. That's what a rational person would have done. But scientists aren't rational when they're on the edge of discovery. And I was holding a plaster cast that would rewrite anthropology textbooks, proof that we share these forests with something that walked like us, thought like us, but chose to remain hidden. I spent 2 hours examining every inch of my campsite, found coarse auburn hairs caught on a Douglas fir where something had leaned against it too high for me to reach without jumping. The bark was compressed and polished from repeated contact, suggesting this tree had been used as a resting spot before. Near the edge of camp, I found what made my scientific mind completely short-circuit. A pattern in the dirt that could only be described as drawing. Curves and lines made with a stick or finger, forming shapes that weren't random but weren't recognizable either. Like a child's first attempt at writing. If the child had fingers twice as long as normal and a completely different concept of symbols. I photographed it from every angle, then sat beside it for 20 minutes just trying to understand. Was it a map? A message? Abstract art? The lines had been drawn deliberately. I could see where the drawing implement had been lifted and replaced. There was intention here, purpose. The rational part of my brain, the part with a PhD, and 20 years of field experience, was screaming that this was impossible. But the evidence was right there in the dirt, in the plaster hardening in my pot, in the hairs I was carefully placing in evidence bags. Something had stood over me while I slept. Something intelligent enough to investigate without disturbing. Something that could have unzipped that tent and done whatever it wanted, but chose instead to leave me a calling card. I touched my grandfather's compass where it hung on its new branch, remembering his words. They test you first, see what kind of man you are. The test, apparently, had only just begun. After the visitation, sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of that morning packing select gear into my day pack, leaving the tent and most of my supplies at base camp. If something that large wanted to investigate my equipment, a few zippers weren't going to stop it. The decision to head toward the canyon was half scientific investigation, half insane compulsion. That's where the wood knocks had originated on night 2. That's where the tracks led, disappearing into a game trail that headed northwest toward a narrow gorge, the topo. Maps labeled Devil's Creek Canyon. The morning was wrong from the start. No birds, no squirrels. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the canopy had stilled. The forest felt like a held breath, that moment before something irreversible happens. I'd made it maybe a mile when I found the first new structure. This one was art. There's no other word for it. 7 young cedars had been bent and woven into a spiral pattern that rose 12 feet off the ground. The trees were still alive, still growing, but trained into this impossible shape. The amount of force required to bend living wood that thick, I couldn't have done it with hydraulic equipment. But it was elegant, beautiful, even. The spiral was mathematically precise, each tree bent at the same angle, the spaces between them uniform. I stood there for 10 minutes, walking around it, trying to understand not just how, but why. What intelligence creates art in the middle of wilderness where no one would see it? Except someone had seen it. I had seen it. Maybe that was the point. I photographed it extensively, then continued toward the canyon. Found 3 more structures over the next hour, each one more elaborate than the last. One looked like a tunnel, branches woven so tightly that I had to get on my hands and knees to see through it. Another might have been a blind for hunting, positioned perfectly to overlook a heavily used game trail. Then I found the shelter. It was built into a natural depression where 2 massive fallen logs formed a V. Branches had been laid across the top, then covered with strips of cedar bark arranged like shingles. The construction was primitive but sophisticated. Those bark strips overlapped in a way that would shed rain perfectly. I approached slowly, calling out, "Hello?" like an idiot, as if whatever built this would answer in English. The entrance was low, maybe 4 feet high, but once inside, the space opened up. Could easily fit something 7 or 8 feet tall if it sat or crouched. My flashlight beam swept the interior, and I forgot to breathe. Bones, dozens of them, but not scattered like the remains of meals. Arranged, organized, sorted by type and size in distinct piles, femurs together, ribs nested, skulls arranged in order of size mouse to deer along one wall. In the center, Flat stones had been placed to create a level surface. On these stones, tools. A hand axe napped from obsidian, its edge sharper than any steel blade I owned. What might have been a scraping tool made from a deer scapula. 3 pointed implements carved from antler, their purpose unclear, but their deliberate manufacture undeniable. And something that stopped me cold, a piece of wood about 8 inches long, carved with parallel lines and hash marks that looked intentionally decorative, or maybe symbolic. The carving was intricate, precise, would have taken hours with primitive tools. It was worn smooth in places, like it had been handled frequently. I picked it up with trembling hands. I know I shouldn't have. Know it was disturbing evidence, but I had to feel the weight of it. Had to run my fingers over those carved marks that something not quite human had made. My body camera recorded my whispered commentary. This is organized, deliberate. The tool manufacturer alone suggests. Jesus, I don't even know what this suggests. Parallel evolution? Sustained culture? These aren't animals. They're people. Some kind of people. I set the carved wood back exactly where I'd found it, but photographed everything. Used my ruler for scale. Took close-ups of tool manufacture marks, the bone arrangements, the construction techniques of the shelter itself. That's when I noticed the smell. Musty, but not unpleasant. Like a barn, but mixed with something else. Wild, primal, and fresh. This shelter had been used recently. Within days, maybe hours. I was documenting the carved wood when the forest exploded. Not literally, but the sudden cacophony of sound. After all, that silence was like a physical blow. Branch breaks big ones, the crack of something snapping 4-inch limbs like twigs. Bipedal footfalls, running. Not away from me, toward me, from 3 different directions. My grandfather's voice in my head. When you're in their place, you're there by their permission. And permission can be revoked. I backed out of the shelter, rifle ready but not raised. Whatever was coming, I was outnumbered, out of my element, and 40 miles from help. The scientific part of my brain noted with detached fascination that this appeared to be coordinated hunting behavior. The primitive part of my brain screamed, "Run!" The footfalls stopped maybe 50 yards out, forming a perimeter. Then the wood knocks started. Not random, patterned, like they were talking to each other, discussing what to do with the intruder in their home. I stood there in front of that shelter, surrounded, but not yet engaged, and made a decision that probably saved my life. I spoke to them. "I'm sorry," I said to the forest, loud enough to carry. "I'm a scientist. I study animals. I didn't mean to intrude. I'm not here to hurt anything. I'm just trying to understand." The wood knocks stopped. Silence stretched for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Then a response. A low vocalization from the direction of the canyon. Not aggressive. Almost. Questioning? It was joined by another from my left, then another from my right. They were talking. About me. Around me. I slowly, carefully, set down my rifle. Held up my empty hands. "I'm going to leave now," I said. "I'm sorry for entering your home." Movement in my peripheral vision. Something large, dark, shifting between the trees to my left, allowing itself to be seen, showing me I was outmaneuvered. I picked up my rifle slowly, making no aggressive moves, and started backing away. Took 3 steps before something whistled through the air and thudded into a tree 6 inches from a stone, fist-sized, thrown with enough force to embed bark in the impact crater. The message was clear. "You can go, but remember, we could have stopped you." I didn't run. Running triggers pursuit instinct in predators, and whatever these things were, they were apex predators. But I walked fast, not looking back, as the forest erupted again with movement. They paralleled me for half a mile, their footfalls deliberately loud, letting me know I was escorted. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The forest went back to normal. Birds resumed singing. A squirrel chattered at me from a branch, like crossing an invisible boundary from their world back to mine. I made it back to base camp by afternoon, packed everything I could carry, and cached the rest. My hands shook the entire time. Not from fear, well, not just from fear. From the magnitude of what I documented. They weren't animals, weren't human. Were something in between, or alongside, or beyond. Something that built shelters and made tools and created art and had culture and intelligence and had been here all along, watching us stumble through their forest tolerating our presence until we crossed lines we didn't even know existed. That night, my last in the Kalmiopsis on that trip, I didn't sleep. Just sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, listening to the wood knocks in the distance. They weren't threatening now. More like commentary, discussion. Maybe laughing at the clumsy human who thought he was the one doing the studying. The morning after finding the shelter started with a lie I told myself, that I was still conducting scientific research. I broke camp before dawn, packing light just water, emergency supplies, one trail camera, and the rifle. Left everything else cached in a tree. If I had to run, 60 pounds of gear would get me killed. The plan was simple. Set up the camera overlooking the shelter, document any activity, then get out. One more day of data collection, before hiking back to civilization with the greatest biological discovery of the century. That's what I told myself as I headed back toward Devil's Creek Canyon. The forest had other plans. The first sign of trouble was the silence. Not the pregnant quiet I'd experienced before, but a complete absence of ambient sound. No insects, no birds. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, like walking through a soundproof room. My breathing was the loudest thing in the forest. I was maybe half a mile from the shelter when the first branch broke. Not a twig. A branch. Something thick enough that the crack echoed off the canyon walls like a gunshot. It came from behind me, maybe 100 yards back on the trail I'd just walked. I stopped. Listened. Nothing. Started walking again. Faster now. Made it another 50 yards before the second break, this time to my left. Then another to my right. The pattern was unmistakable. I was being bracketed, flanked. 20 years studying predator behavior, and I'd never experienced anything like this. Wolves hunt in packs, but they're direct, following scent trails, running down prey through endurance. Cougars are ambush predators, silent until the moment of attack. This was different, calculated. They wanted me to know I was being herded. I tried to double back, take a different trail toward higher ground. Found my path blocked by a massive Douglas fir that hadn't been across the trail an hour earlier. The trunk was 4 feet thick, would have taken a crew with chainsaws to drop it. But there it was, the root ball still dripping soil, torn from the earth by something with impossible strength. That's when the wood knocks started. 3 knocks from behind. Answer from the left, 2 knocks. Response from the right, 4 knocks. Rapid fire. They were talking, coordinating, and I was the subject of discussion. I could feel my professional composure cracking, replaced by something older, that primitive part of your brain that kept your ancestors alive when humans were prey. My hands were steady on the rifle, but sweat ran down my back despite the morning chill. The hurting intensified. Every time I tried to change direction, a new obstacle appeared. Fallen trees, walls of broken branches. Once, a volley of stones that struck the ground 5 feet in front of me, a warning shot that said, "Not that way." They were pushing me toward the canyon. Toward the narrow defile where the walls were steep and escape routes were limited. The tactical part of my brain recognized the strategy funnel prey into a kill box. But the scientific part was fascinated even through the fear. This level of coordination, the ability to predict my movements and cut off escapes, suggested cognitive abilities that shouldn't exist in any non-human species. I keyed my emergency beacon, then thought better of it. Help was 8 hours away at best. Whatever was going to happen would be long over by then. The footfalls started when I was forced onto the trail leading to the canyon. Heavy, bipedal, deliberately loud. They wanted me to hear them. 3 sets, maybe 4, paralleling my path through the trees. I caught glimpses, dark shapes moving between the trunks, always at the edge of vision, never quite clear enough to see details. My body camera was recording everything. The measured breathing that wasn't quite human, the crack of branches that marked their passage, my own whispered commentary, multiple subjects, coordinated movement, herding behavior. They're pushing me toward the canyon. This is intelligent hunting behavior. I reached a small clearing where 2 trails diverged. Left led up the ridge, potential escape. Right led deeper into the canyon. I started left. The tree came down so close, I felt the wind from its fall. A Port Orford cedar, 60 feet tall, slammed across the trail with enough force to shake the ground. The message was clear, there was only one way I was allowed to go. "Okay," I said aloud, surprising myself. "Okay, you win. I'll go where you want." The forest seemed to pause. The footfalls stopped. For a moment, I wondered if speaking to them had changed something. Then the vocalization started. Low, rumbling calls from multiple directions. Not aggressive, more like discussion, commentary. They lasted maybe 30 seconds, this exchange of sounds that had structure and rhythm but no meaning I could parse. When they stopped, the herding resumed, but less aggressive now, like they'd decided something. The footfalls maintained their distance. The wood knocks became less frequent. They were still directing me toward the canyon, but it felt less like being hunted and more like being escorted. I let them guide me. What choice did I have? But I kept the rifle ready, safety off, finger indexed along the trigger guard. My grandfather had taught me that never put your finger on the trigger unless you're ready to destroy what you're aiming at. The trail narrowed as we approached the canyon proper. The walls rose on either side, ancient rock covered in moss and ferns. The sound of Devil's Creek grew louder, water rushing over stones somewhere below. This was their chosen ground. Whatever they wanted to kill me, to warn me, to study me, it would happen here. I stopped at the canyon entrance, that narrow gap where the trail descended into shadow. Turned slowly, looking for my escorts. They'd gone quiet, but I could feel them watching, waiting. "I know you're intelligent," I said to the forest. "I know you understand more than any animal should. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just trying to understand." A rock struck the ground at my feet. Not thrown aggressively placed, rolled to a stop against my boot. I looked down at it, then up at the tree line where it had originated. Movement, deliberate, something large shifting position to be seen. Just a shape between the trees, but massive. Upright, watching. Another rock rolled from a different direction. Then, another. 3 rocks, forming a rough arrow pointing into the canyon. The message couldn't have been clearer. Go deeper. I picked up one of the rocks, smooth river stone, still damp, and held it up. "I understand," I said. Then I walked into the canyon, knowing I was walking into their world on their terms, knowing that whatever happened next would either make me famous or make me disappear, like so many others who'd pushed too deep into the Kalmiopsis. Behind me, the forest erupted in movement as they followed. 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time, October 17th, 2019. I know the exact moment because my body camera timestamped it. The moment everything I thought I knew about the natural world shattered like safety glass. I was 300 yards into Devil's Creek Canyon when it happened. The walls had narrowed to maybe 40 feet apart, old growth rising from both rims, creating a tunnel of green twilight even in midday. The creek ran loud here, white water over granite boulders, the sound echoing off the walls. I'd stopped to check my GPS, verify my position, when the birds went quiet. Not gradually. Instantly, like someone had thrown a switch. The jays that had been following me, hoping for dropped food, vanished. Even the creek seemed to quiet, though I know that's impossible. Then the smell hit me. Musky, but not unpleasant. Like a horse barn mixed with something wilder. Pine sap, wet earth, and underneath it all, something almost human but not quite. It was strong enough that I tasted it on the back of my tongue. I turned slowly, rifle held low but ready, scanning the tree line on both sides of the canyon. Nothing, just shadows between the trunks. But the smell was getting stronger. Movement. East side of the canyon, 60 yards up the slope. At first, my brain tried to make it a bear. That's what you do when you see something impossible. You force it into a category that makes sense. But bears don't walk upright with that fluid grace. Bears don't carry tools. It emerged from the tree line like something stepping out of prehistory. 8 feet tall, maybe more hard to judge at that distance with the slope, covered in dark auburn hair that caught the filtered sunlight, not like fur but like the hair on your arm, just everywhere. The face was what stopped my breathing. Almost human in structure, but wrong. Heavier brow, wider jaw, eyes set deeper but unmistakably intelligent. It was carrying something. A staff, or maybe a walking stick, but carved or shaped somehow. Not a random branch, but something made, created. The way it held it suggested familiarity, comfort, like how a hiker carries a trekking pole. We saw each other in the same instant. It stopped mid-stride, one foot still raised. I froze completely, not even breathing. My body camera would later show that we stood like that for 7 seconds, though it felt like 7 hours. Its eyes were brown. I could see them clearly at that distance, large, expressive, studying me with the same intensity I was studying it. There was no aggression in its posture. Curiosity, maybe. Calculation, definitely. It tilted its head slightly, the way a dog does when it's trying to understand something. I should have stayed still. Should have backed away slowly. Should have done anything except what 20 years of academic training compelled me to do. I raised my camera hand to try to adjust the body camera for a better angle. The creature shifted instantly. Weight forward, free hand, coming up. Not attacking, but alert. Ready. The way it moved was impossibly fluid for something that size. Muscle groups rippled under that auburn hair, showing a physique that was both human-like and utterly alien. Easy, I heard myself say. My voice cracked. I'm not going to hurt you. It took a step forward. Just one, but it covered 6 feet. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Arms too long, torso too thick, legs bent at angles that suggested a different mechanical structure. But it moved with purpose, intelligence. That's when I noticed the pendant, something hanging from its neck on what might have been braided plant fiber, a piece of carved wood, similar to what I'd found in the shelter. It swung as the creature moved, and I realized with a sick feeling that this wasn't just an animal. This was a being with culture, with decoration, with the cognitive ability to create purely aesthetic objects. It made a sound, low, rumbling, starting in its chest and rolling up through its throat, not a growl. More like a question? There was tonal variation, rising at the end like interrogative inflection. I should have answered, should have tried to communicate, but my hand was moving toward the rifle, some primitive autopilot taking over. The creature saw it, saw my hand drift toward the weapon. Everything changed in an instant. It raised its free arm not aggressively, but in what I've replayed 1,000 times as either a warning or greeting, palm facing me, fingers spread. The gesture was so human, so recognizable, that it should have registered as peaceful, but I was 40 miles from help, alone, facing something that shouldn't exist, and my nervous system made a decision before my brain could intervene. Time dilated the way it does in car accidents. I saw my hand finding the rifle stock, felt it swing up, saw the creature's eyes widen, surprise, not anger. Watched it start to turn, mouth opening to vocalize something. The rifle was at my shoulder, the scope filled with auburn hair. My finger found the trigger. No, I said, but my finger was already squeezing. The 30-06 roared in the canyon, the sound apocalyptic between those walls. The recoil punched my shoulder. Through the scope, I saw the impact high on the left shoulder, spinning the creature partially around. The sound it made will haunt me until I die. Not a scream, not a roar. Something between the two, with an undertone that was distinctly, horribly human. Pain mixed with betrayal, confusion. Like it couldn't understand why I'd done this when it had approached peacefully. It didn't fall. Something that size, shot with a round that can drop an elk, should have gone down. But it turned with incredible speed and vanished into the trees. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, and underneath that, vocalizations that sounded like words. Not English, but structured. Linguistic. I stood there in the ringing silence, rifle still at my shoulder, watching blood spatter on the ferns where it had stood. Bright red blood. So very human-looking in the afternoon light. Oh God, I heard myself saying. Oh God, what have I done? What have I done? The forest exploded with answers. Wood knocks from every direction. Rapid fire, aggressive. Vocalizations that needed no translation. Anger, alarm, distress. They were coming. All of them. I ran. Not away from where the creature had fled toward it. Some insane combination of scientific duty and moral horror driving me to follow, to help, to understand what I'd just shot. My body camera bounced wildly as I scrambled up the slope, following the blood trail that was so much more abundant than it should have been. Behind me, around me, the forest raged with movement. They were coming for their wounded family member, coming for the man who just violated whatever treaty had existed between our species. But I had to know, had to see, had to face what I'd done. The blood trail led deeper into the canyon, and I followed. knowing I might be running toward my own death, but unable to stop myself. The scientist in me needed answers. The human in me needed to apologize, even if the apology killed me. The woods crashed around me as I ran toward a reckoning I'd earned with one panicked pull of a trigger. Toward the cave, where I'd find evidence that would vindicate me to some and damn me to others. Toward the terrible understanding that I'd just shot something that might have been trying to say hello. The sound of that shot still wakes me up at night. 5 years later, and I can still feel the rifle buck against my shoulder. Still see the muzzle flash in my peripheral vision. Still hear the echo bouncing off those canyon walls like the world breaking apart. But it's what came after that really haunts me. I stood frozen for maybe 3 seconds after pulling the trigger, watching the spot where the creature had vanished into the undergrowth. Blood on the ferns. Bright red, arterial spray pattern, exactly like you'd see from a human wound. My hands started shaking so bad I nearly dropped the rifle. "Oh God," I kept saying. "Oh God, what have I done?" The forest answered with rage. Wood knocks erupted from every direction, not the measured communication patterns from before, but rapid-fire bursts that sounded like machine gun fire made of wood. Vocalizations that didn't need translation. Alarm, fury, distress. They were coming. All of them. But I couldn't run. Something in me, scientist, human, grandson of a man who taught me that you never leave wounded game to suffer, compelled me forward. I had to follow that blood trail. Had to know what I'd shot. Had to try to help, even though I knew that was insane. The blood trail was easy to follow. Too easy. Drops and splashes on leaves, smears on tree trunks at about 7 feet high where it had steadied itself. The pattern showed a lurching gait, favoring the left side. The bullet had hit high on the shoulder, hopefully missed the lung, but definitely caught muscle and bone. I followed for 20 minutes, crashing through Devil's Club and Salal, my body camera recording my ragged breathing and whispered commentary. Significant blood loss. Stride length shortened. It's hurt bad. Christ, what was I thinking? The trail led upslope, away from the creek, toward a cluster of basalt outcroppings I'd noticed on the topo map. The blood was getting heavier, not drops anymore, but steady streams. Whatever I'd shot was losing too. Much blood to go much farther. That's when I found the first clear footprint in the blood-soaked earth. 19 inches long, 5 toes clearly visible. Ball of the foot deeper than the heel. The mid-tarsal break, that impossible flex in the middle that humans don't have. But the toes gripped the soil like fingers, leaving knuckle impressions as it pushed off. I was tracking something that walked like us but wasn't us. Something that bled like us but wasn't us. Something that had looked at me with intelligent eyes before I put a bullet in it. The wood knocks were getting closer. I could hear movement in the brush, multiple individuals, paralleling my path, closing in. But I kept following the blood trail, drawn by equal parts scientific need and moral horror. 20 yards ahead, the brush thrashed. A vocalization pain mixed with something else. Not quite animal, not quite human, but unmistakably suffering. It was still alive, still moving. I should have been terrified, should have run. But all I felt was sick guilt. "I'm sorry," I called out, knowing how insane that sounded. "I didn't mean. I'm so sorry." The thrashing stopped. Silence, except for my own harsh breathing and the distant wood knocks growing more agitated. I pushed through a wall of rhododendron and found myself at the entrance to a cave. Not a deep one, more of a overhang in the basalt, maybe 15 feet deep and 20 wide. The blood trail led directly inside. And there, at the back of the cave, I saw movement. A shape in the shadows, massive, hunched, breathing in ragged gasps. The smell hit me, blood mixed with that musky, almost human scent from before, but stronger now. Fear, pheromones. Pain chemistry. My flashlight beam caught eyes reflecting green in the darkness, watching me, waiting. I set down the rifle, held up my empty hands. "I'm not going to hurt you again," I said. I study animals. I know first aid. Maybe I can help. Insane. Talking to it like it could. Understand. But those eyes tracked my movements with clear intelligence, narrowing when I reached for my pack. The wood knocks outside reached a crescendo, then stopped. They were here, surrounding the cave, waiting to see what would happen. The creature, I couldn't think of it as an it anymore, not after seeing those eyes shifted in the shadows. A hand came into the light. Not a paw, a hand. Massive, with fingers longer than mine, covered in that auburn hair. but undeniably a hand. It was pressed against the wound, blood seeping between the fingers. "Pressure's good," I heard myself say. "Keep pressure on it." The hand withdrew into the shadows. A vocalization, lower this time. Still pained, but questioning? The tonal shift was unmistakable. I took one step into the cave, then another, my hands visible and empty. The creature didn't retreat, but I could see muscles tensing under that coat of hair. It could kill me with one swing of those arms, wounded or not. 3 more steps and I could see it clearly. Him. Definitely male, based on the anatomy. 8 feet tall, even hunched in pain. The musculature was wrong for a human, too thick in the torso, arms too long, legs bent at angles that suggested a different mechanical structure. But the face was almost human. Heavier brow, wider jaw, nose flatter and broader. But the eyes brown, expressive, showing pain and fear, and something that might have been confusion. This close, I could see details my camera would later reveal. The hair wasn't uniform, thinner on the face and palms, thicker on the back and shoulders, scars on the arms that looked old, healed. That wooden pendant still hanging from the woven cord around his neck. The wound was bad. The bullet had caught him just below the left shoulder joint, punching through the deltoid and probably cracking the scapula. Blood pulsed with each heartbeat. Without treatment, he'd bleed out within hours. "I have medical supplies," I said, gesturing to my 40. "I can help. But your family? They have to know I'm trying to help." He looked at me for a long moment, then tilted his head back and vocalized not the scream of pain from before, but something structured. Call and response from outside. More vocalizations, what sounded like discussion. Then he looked back at me and did something that changed everything I thought I knew about human evolution. He nodded. Not a mimicked gesture. A clear, deliberate nod of understanding and consent. I approached slowly, pulling out my first aid kit with shaking hands. The wound was even worse, up close, definitely through and through, the exit wound larger and ragged. I used my entire supply of gauze and pressure bandages, working while he watched with those 2 human eyes, occasionally making soft vocalizations when I had to press hard to control the bleeding. His blood was warm on my hands, red like mine, and when I checked his pulse, massive neck, he had to use 3 fingers to find the artery. It was fast, but strong, maybe 100 beats per minute. Not that different from a human in distress. I worked for maybe 10 minutes, using every bit of wilderness first responder training I had. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. He needed real medical attention, surgery, antibiotics, things I couldn't provide. When I finished, we looked at each other, killer and victim, scientist and subject. 2 species that shouldn't exist in the same world, sharing a cave that smelled of blood and fear. "I'm sorry," I said again. He raised his good hand slowly, carefully, and touched his chest, then pointed at me, then made a gesture I didn't understand, fingers moving in a pattern that meant something in his world but nothing in mine. A rock clattered at the cave entrance, then another. I turned to see shapes in the forest, dark figures among the trees. His family, his tribe, whatever they were. Waiting. "I should go," I said. He vocalized again, soft, almost like a whisper, pointed at the cave entrance with his good hand. The message was clear. Leave. I gathered my supplies, picked up my rifle, and backed out of the cave. The figures in the forest shifted but didn't approach. As I reached the entrance, I turned back one last time. He was still watching me, still bleeding through my bandages, still dying from my bullet. The last thing I saw before the forest swallowed me was him raising that massive hand in what might have been farewell, or forgiveness, or accusation. I'll never know which. I followed that blood trail back through the forest like a man in a nightmare, knowing I should run but unable to stop myself from documenting what I'd done. My body camera recorded everything, my shaking hands, collecting hair samples from where he'd brushed against trees, the bloody footprints I photographed with my ruler for scale, my whispered field notes that sounded increasingly unhinged. The figures in the forest followed me. I couldn't see them clearly, but they were there, shadows moving between the trees, maintaining a perimeter around me as I worked. They could have killed me at any point, should have, probably, but they just watched as I gathered evidence of their existence with the same clinical detachment I'd use for any other species. Except this wasn't any other species. The blood samples went into sterile vials, hair samples into evidence bags. I cast one partial footprint where he'd slipped in his own blood. The detail was incredible. Dermal ridges, like fingerprints, a scar across the big toe, individual characteristics that would identify him as surely as any human footprint. After an hour of this manic evidence collection, I found myself back at the cave, not the one where I'd tried to treat his wound, a different one, deeper in the same basalt formation. The blood trail didn't lead here, but something else did. Intuition, maybe. Or the way the shadows in the forest seemed to funnel me toward it. The entrance was partially hidden by a fallen Douglas fir, the trunk creating a natural blind. I had to squeeze through a gap between the tree and the rock face. Inside, my flashlight revealed a space that stopped my breathing. It was a home. Not a den, not a lair, a home. The cave extended back maybe 30 feet, naturally formed but modified. Rocks had been moved to create level surfaces. The walls showed evidence of tools, scrape marks where the rock had been shaped to create shelves and storage spaces. A natural chimney gap in the ceiling would provide ventilation and let smoke escape. But it was the contents that made me sink to my knees. Sleeping areas made from woven branches and what looked like bear pelts. Food storage, dried meat, nuts, roots I couldn't identify, all carefully separated in baskets woven from cedar bark. Tools everywhere. Stone blades, wooden spears with fire-hardened points. What might have been a bow, though cruder than any human artifact. And in one corner, something that made me understand these weren't just clever animals. Art. Pieces of wood and stone that served no utilitarian purpose. Patterns carved into the cave wall, spirals and lines and shapes that meant something to the artist. A collection of interesting rocks and shells that could only be decorative. A wooden figure, crudely carved but unmistakably representing a smaller version of themselves. A child's toy. They had children, families, culture. I sat there in their home, blood still under my fingernails from trying to save the one I'd shot, and felt the full weight of what I'd done. I hadn't shot an animal. I hadn't even shot a missing link or an evolutionary oddity. I'd shot a person. A different kind of person, but a person nonetheless. My body camera captured my breakdown. The way I sobbed, "I'm sorry," over and over to the empty cave. The way my hands shook as I photographed everything, unable to stop being a scientist even in the midst of moral collapse. The way I carefully touched, nothing, moved nothing, took nothing except pictures and samples of hair caught on the rough walls. The vocalization started as I was documenting the carved patterns. Low, melodic, coming from outside the cave, not threatening, mournful. It sounded like singing, like a dirge. I crawled out of the cave to find them waiting. 3 of them. No. 4, one smaller figure behind the others, partially hidden. They stood at the edge of the forest, maybe 30 yards away, backlit by the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy. I couldn't make out details, but their silhouettes were unmistakably humanoid. Tall, broad, standing upright with that slightly forward lean I'd observed before. We looked at each other across that space. 4 members of one species studying the single representative of another. The one in front, larger than the others, older based on the way it moved, raised its hand. Not in greeting. It pointed at me, then swept its arm toward the direction of my camp. The message was clear. Leave. Now. But there was something else in that gesture. Not just get out, but get out before the others arrive. A warning. Protection. I nodded, the same deliberate nod the wounded one had given me. The large one tilted its head, studying me. Then it reached down and picked up something from the ground. A stone. For a moment, I thought it would throw it at me. Instead, it placed the stone carefully on a stump between us, pointed at the stone, then at me, then made a gesture I didn't understand, both hands moving apart, like breaking something. It would take me weeks to understand what that meant. The stone was a treaty marker. The gesture meant broken. I had broken a treaty I didn't even know existed. They turned and melted back into the forest, taking the smaller one with them. But I heard them for the next hour as I made my way back to camp, wood knocks in patterns that sounded like communication, vocalizations that might have been coordinating movement, the occasional crack of a branch. That let me know I was still being escorted. I reached my base camp as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. My tent was undisturbed, but surrounded by footprints. They'd investigated everything while I was gone, but taken nothing, damaged nothing. Professional courtesy between researchers. That night, I sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, listening to the forest mourn. The vocalizations continued until dawn, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always haunting. It sounded like grief, like rage, like a community trying to make sense of sudden violence from a species they'd successfully avoided for generations. I didn't sleep, just sat there reviewing my camera footage, looking at the blood on my hands and the LED screen's glow, and wondering how many of them were out there. Dozens? Hundreds? How many generations had they spent perfecting the art of being invisible to us? How many times had they watched us stumble through their territory, choosing concealment over contact, until I'd forced contact with a bullet. The wooden pendant, the wounded one, where I had clear footage of it. The carving was intricate, deliberate. It might have been decorative, or might have marked status, or family group. Either way, it marked him as an individual, not a specimen, not a cryptid, someone's son, someone's father, someone's friend. Someone I'd shot because I was scared of something different. As dawn lightened the sky, I made my decision. I would leave, but not empty-handed. I had evidence that would either vindicate or damn me. Proof that we shared these forests with another intelligent species. But I also had blood on my hands that would never wash clean. And somewhere in those woods, if he survived the night, was a being with a bullet wound that would forever mark humanity's first contact with his species. I broke camp as the sun rose, packing everything I could carry. Before leaving, I emptied my pack of all my remaining food, every MRE, every energy bar, every packet of trail mix. I arranged it carefully on a flat stone, the same way they'd arranged things in their cave. An offering, an apology, an acknowledgement that I was in their world, not mine. When I looked back from the trail, a figure stood at the edge of my former campsite, tall, motionless, watching. It didn't move as I shouldered my pack and headed for the trailhead, but I felt its eyes on me until the forest finally swallowed the distance between us. I made it back to my base camp just as the last light drained from the sky, my legs shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. The familiar sight of my orange tent should have been comforting. Instead, it looked alien, fragile, a joke of protection in a forest that suddenly felt hostile. Fresh tracks circled the entire campsite. Not one set. Multiple. At least 4 different individuals based on size variations, one set significantly smaller than the others, maybe a juvenile. They'd investigated everything while I was at the cave. My equipment cases had been opened and carefully closed. My food bag, which I'd hung 15 feet up in a tree, had been lowered, examined, and rehung. Nothing taken, nothing damaged. But the message was clear. We were here. We could have destroyed everything. We chose not to. I collapsed onto a log, rifle across my lap, and tried to process what had happened. The blood under my fingernails, the wound I'd bandaged with my own hands, those intelligent eyes looking at me with, what? Understanding? Accusation? Forgiveness? My body camera had recorded everything. 4 hours and 17 minutes of footage that would either make me famous or destroy my career. I started reviewing it on my camera's small screen, but my hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. The vocalizations started at 9:47 p.m., not the wood knocks from before. Actual vocalizations. They came from multiple directions, starting low and mournful, rising and falling in patterns that had structure, syntax. It sounded like language, not human language, but language nonetheless. Questions and answers, call and response. A conversation I couldn't understand but recognized as communication. I hit record on my audio equipment and just sat there listening, tears running down my face that I didn't bother to wipe away. They were discussing me. Had to be. The one who'd shot their family member. The one who'd tried to help. The one who'd entered their home and taken nothing but pictures. What to do with me. Around midnight, something approached my camp. Heavy footsteps, not trying to hide. I gripped the rifle but didn't raise it. I'd done enough damage for one day. The footsteps stopped maybe 20 feet from my tent. Then, a thud. Something heavy hitting the ground. Silence. I waited 5 minutes before investigating. Flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. At the edge of my camp, placed deliberately on a flat rock, was the body of a deer, a young doe, neck cleanly broken, still warm. No claw marks, no bite wounds. Killed with what looked like a single twist of massive hands. Next to it, 3 stones arranged in a pattern. 1 large, 2 small. The same configuration I'd seen at the cave entrance. I understood, or thought I did. The large stone was the wounded one. The 2 smaller ones were... what? Family members? Children? The deer was... payment? Trade? An offering to show they could provide food even while caring for their wounded? "Thank you," I said to the darkness. I'm sorry. A low vocalization from the trees. Not aggressive. Almost conversational. Then footsteps moving away. I spent the rest of the night recording everything into my camera. Every detail I could remember. The creature's height, 8 feet, 2 inches, based on comparison to trees in the footage. Weight, 400 to 500 pounds, based on footprint depth. Hair color dark auburn with some graying on the shoulder's age indicator. The pendant 2.5 inches long, intricate carving possibly. The tools in the cave, napped obsidian, sharper than surgical steel, antler implements, showing wear patterns from extended use. I talked until my voice went hoarse, the scientist in me unable to stop documenting even as the human in me grappled with what I'd done. Subject showed clear signs of higher intelligence. I heard myself saying at 3 a.m. Tool use, decorative items, possible symbolic communication through stone arrangements, social structure, indicated by coordinated group response. Empathy, suggested by the fact that they didn't kill me when they had every right to. The wood knocks continued all night, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough that I could hear the impact echo through the trees. They were keeping watch, making sure I knew they were there, making sure I knew I existed at their discretion. At 4:30 a.m., something screamed in the distance. Not human, not quite animal. Pain and rage and grief mixed into a sound that made my primitive brain want to run until I collapsed. It went on for maybe 10 seconds, then cut off abruptly. The forest went completely silent. Even the creek seemed to pause. Then, from much closer, a response. Softer, mournful. What could only be described as crying. Something out there was crying, and it sounded almost human. I put my head in my hands and whispered apologies to the darkness. Apologies for the shot, for the wound, for the violation of entering their space, for the arrogance of thinking I had the right to study them like any other animal. They weren't animals. They were people. Different people, but people. And I'd shot one of them because I was afraid. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening in increments while fog rolled through the trees. The vocalizations had stopped an hour earlier, replaced by occasional wood knocks that seemed more like position checks than communication. I made my decision as the first birds started their morning calls. I would leave, take my evidence, and go. But first, I had a debt to pay. I packed quickly but carefully, organizing my samples and recordings with the methodical precision of 2 decades of field work. Blood samples in the cooler, hair samples in evidence bags, plaster cast wrapped in bubble wrap, memory cards in waterproof cases. Everything labeled, cataloged, documented. Then I emptied my pack of all my remaining food, every MRE, every energy bar, every bag of trail mix, the emergency rations I always kept sealed, the chocolate bars I'd been saving for the hike out, all of it. I arranged it carefully on the same flat rock where they'd left the deer, an offering, an apology, an acknowledgement of the debt I'd incurred with that pulled trigger. Before leaving, I did something that wasn't scientific, wasn't rational. I took my grandfather's compass, the brass one he'd carried in Korea, the one he'd held while telling me stories about the tall men in the woods, and set it on top of the food pile. He would have wanted you to have this, I said to the forest. He would have understood what you are. He tried to tell me, but I didn't listen. I'm sorry. The woods were quiet as I shouldered my pack, 60 pounds of evidence that would change everything, or destroy everything. But as I turned to leave, movement caught my eye. A figure at the edge of the clearing. Tall, still, watching. Not the one I'd shot, this one was older, grayer, moving with the careful precision of age. It stood there, half hidden by a massive Douglas fir, and we looked at each other across maybe 50 yards of space. I nodded, the same deliberate nod the wounded one had given me. The figure raised one hand, massive, covered in that distinctive hair, and held it up for a moment, palm facing me, the same gesture the wounded one had made just before I shot him. This time, I understood. Not a threat, not a warning. A farewell, maybe forgiveness. Probably not. The hike out was 11 miles of psychological torture. They followed me the entire way. Not pursuing, escorting, making sure I left, making sure I knew they were there, making sure I understood that this was their forest and I was leaving it alive by their choice. I never saw them clearly, just glimpses, a shadow moving between trees, a shape on a ridgeline silhouetted against the morning sky for just a moment, the crack of a branch that was too deliberate to be wind. They wanted me to know I was being watched. The trail that had taken me 6 hours to hike in took 9 hours to hike out. Not because I was moving slowly, I was pushing as hard as I could with 60 pounds of evidence on my back. But I kept finding obstacles that hadn't been there before. A tree across the trail that I had to climb over, my pack catching on branches, stones arranged in patterns that made me stop and document them, unable to help myself even in my desperation to leave. Once, fresh footprints in a muddy section deliberately placed where I couldn't miss them, toes splayed wide, showing dermal ridges as clear as fingerprints. They were leaving me evidence, making sure I had proof. But why? 3 miles from the trailhead, I found the stone arrow. It was built in the middle of the trail, impossible to miss. Dozens of river rocks arranged in a perfect arrow shape, pointing back the way I'd come. The message was clear: you should go back. But there was something else. In the center of the arrow, a piece of carved wood, similar to the pendant the wounded one had worn, but simpler. 3 parallel lines cut deep into what looked like cedar, still fresh enough that I could smell the sap. I picked it up with shaking hands, turned it over. On the back, marks that looked deliberate but meant nothing to me. A message in a language I'd never learned to read. "I can't go back," I said to the forest. "I'm sorry, but I can't. I have to leave. You understand that, right? I have to leave." A wood knock from very close, maybe 30 feet to my left, then another to my right. They were right. There, just out of sight. Close enough that I could smell them, that musky, almost human scent that would haunt me for years. I pocketed the carved wood and kept walking. 2 miles from the trailhead, they stopped hiding. 3 of them stepped onto the trail ahead of me, not blocking it, standing to the side, allowing me to pass if I chose, but making absolutely sure I saw them. The one on the left was massive, probably 8.5 feet, with reddish-brown hair that caught the afternoon sun. Male, based on the build. Middle-aged, maybe, though how could I judge the age of something that shouldn't exist? The one on the right was smaller, maybe 7 feet, with darker hair and a more slender build. Female? The way she stood suggested a protective posture, one hand resting on the small one, a juvenile, maybe 5 feet tall, holding the female's hand, peering at me with eyes that were unmistakably curious. A child. They had brought a child to see the human who had shot one of their family members. We stood there, maybe 20 feet apart, studying each other. The adult male made a low vocalization. The female responded with something that sounded like agreement. The child tried to step forward, but the female held it back with gentle pressure. I slowly, carefully, set down my pack, held up my empty hands, then did something that surprised even me. I sat down on the trail, made myself smaller, less threatening. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm so sorry." The male tilted his head, studying me. Then he did something that broke my heart. He touched his left shoulder exactly where I'd shot the other one, pointed at me, then made a gesture with both hands that looked like breaking something. "Yes," I said. "I broke something. I broke trust. I broke everything." The female vocalized something to the child, who responded with what sounded like a question. She answered, longer this time, and I swear I heard the cadence of explanation. She was telling the child about me, about what I'd done, about what I was. The child looked at me with those impossibly human eyes and made a sound that needed no translation. Disappointment, maybe disgust. They stood there for another moment. Then the male made a decisive gesture. He pointed at me, then pointed down the trail toward the parking area. The message was clear: leave and don't come back. But then he did something else. He reached up and touched something hanging from his neck, another wooden pendant, similar to what the wounded one had worn. He made a complex gesture with his hands, touching his chest, then pointing at me, then sweeping his arm toward the mountains behind him. I think he was telling me they would remember, that I was marked now, known, that every one of them would know what I'd done. They stepped off the trail and vanished into the forest with barely a sound, the child looking back once with those curious eyes before the female guided it away. I sat there for 5 minutes, crying like I hadn't cried since my grandfather's funeral. Then I shouldered my pack and finished the hike. My truck was where I'd left it 6 days earlier, covered in pine needles and bird droppings, real-world evidence that time had passed normally while I'd been in their world. The parking area was empty October weekday, no other hikers stupid enough to tackle the Kalmiopsis alone. I threw my pack in the bed and was about to get in when I saw it. A handprint on the driver's side window, massive, fingers spread wide, pressed deliberately into the dust and pollen that covered the glass. They'd been here, checked my vehicle, made sure they knew how I'd arrived and how I'd leave. Below the handprint, finger drawn in the dust, 3 vertical lines, the same symbol from the carved wood they'd left me. I looked around the empty parking area, knowing they were watching from the trees, raised my hand in farewell. No response, but I felt their eyes on me. The drive out was 20 miles, of rough forest service road. I white-knuckled it the whole way, checking my mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see them following even though I knew they wouldn't leave their territory. When I finally hit pavement, I pulled over and threw up. Nerves, exhaustion, the weight of what had happened, it all hit at once. I sat on the guardrail, looking back at the mountains that held their secret, and tried to figure out what to do with the evidence that would change everything. My phone, which had been dead for days, buzzed to life as I hit cell range. 17 missed calls from my wife, 4 from the department, 2 from my research assistant wondering where my data was. The normal world, where Bigfoot was a myth and respected biologists didn't claim to have shot one. I looked at the blood samples in my cooler, the hair samples in evidence bags, the plaster cast of a footprint that shouldn't exist, the body camera full of footage that would either make me famous or destroy me. Then I thought about that child's disappointed eyes, the male's gesture of breaking, the female's protective stance. They weren't specimens, they were a family I'd violated with violence and then documented like any other animal. But the evidence, the scientific importance, the need to prove they existed so they could be protected. I sat there for an hour, wrestling with a decision that would define the rest of my life. In the end, the scientist won, or maybe lost, depending on how you look at it. I drove home with 60 pounds of evidence and a weight on my conscience that no amount of scientific discovery could lift. Behind me, the Kalmiopsis kept its secret, and somewhere in those dark forests, a wounded being wore my bandages and his family remembered my face. The 3 vertical lines from the carved wood are still in my pocket as I tell you this story. I've never figured out what they mean. Warning? Curse? Identification? Or maybe just a reminder that there are things in this world that deserve to remain hidden. And sometimes the greatest scientific discovery is the one you wish you'd never made. I drove straight home from the Kalmiopsis, 11 hours through the night, stopping only for gas and to vomit twice more from nerves. Walked through my front door at 3 a.m. to find my wife asleep on the couch, having waited up until she couldn't anymore. "Where the hell have you been?" she asked, seeing my face. "Marcus, what happened?" I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Just mumbled something about equipment failure and went straight to my home office, locking the door behind me. The footage was all there on my body camera. 4 hours and 17 minutes that would either vindicate me or destroy everything I'd built over 20 years. I watched it, frame by frame on my computer, a glass of whiskey, untouched, beside me, noting details I'd missed in the moment. The creature's eyes at 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 33 seconds, brown, intelligent, showing what looked like curiosity before I raised the rifle. The way its fingers gripped the wooden staff, at 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 41 seconds, opposable thumb, clearly visible, tool use, unambiguous. The pendant at 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 45 seconds, carved with symbols that suggested language, culture, meaning beyond simple decoration. At 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 52 seconds, the frame, just before I pulled the trigger, you could see its mouth starting to open. Not in a threat display. The lip movement suggested vocalization. It had been about to speak, or at least try to communicate, when my bullet stopped it. I enhanced the image until pixels broke apart, staring at that face that was almost human but fundamentally other. The brow ridge was pronounced but not primitive. The nose was broader, flatter, but clearly capable of the same breathing patterns as ours. The muscle attachments suggested it could make complex facial expressions. This wasn't a missing link. This was a parallel line, something that evolved alongside us, not before us. The blood samples went to 3 different labs under different pretenses. One as potential contamination in an elk survey, another as an unknown primate sample from a zoo, the third as a possible bear-human contact scenario. I used fake names, different credit cards, had results sent to P.O. boxes. While waiting for results, I showed the footage to Sarah Chen, my department chair. We sat in her office with the blinds closed, watching my cameras recording on her computer. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," she whispered when it ended. This can't be real. The blood samples are at labs now. DNA results in 2 weeks. She was quiet for a long time, studying freeze frames with the eye of someone who'd spent a decade with orangutans in Sumatra. The locomotion is wrong for a human in a suit. The muscle movement under the hair, the way the feet grip the ground. Marcus, if this is real, it changes everything. It destroys everything, she corrected. Your career, the department's reputation. You shot it, for God's sake. You shot something that appears to be intelligent. It was reaching toward me. I panicked. The Iroquois Nation versus Henderson precedent establishes that killing an undiscovered intelligent species could be prosecuted as murder. She pulled up the legal database on her computer. There's literally case law about this from when European colonizers didn't recognize indigenous peoples as human. My stomach turned. I hadn't even considered the legal implications. There's more, I said, showing her the photos from the cave. The tools, the art, the carved wooden pieces. They have culture, Sarah, family structures. They brought a child to see me on the way out. She looked at me for a long time. You have to bury this. What? Bury it. Delete everything. Destroy the samples. Pretend it never happened. I can't do that. This is the discovery of the century. Proof that we're not alone. That another intelligent species, that you shot. She leaned forward. Marcus, think about what happens when this gets out. The media circus, the legal ramifications, every cryptozoology nut in the world descending on the Kalmiopsis, the military applications if they're real, the extinction that will follow. She was right. I knew she was right, but the scientist in me couldn't accept it. 3 days later, the first lab results came back. The tech who called sounded confused. Dr. Smith, your sample shows significant contamination. We're reading markers from multiple primate species, including some sequences we can't identify. Might be degraded human DNA mixed with something else. Want us to run it again? No, thank you. The second lab was more direct. This some kind of joke? The sample shows chimeric properties that don't occur in nature. Either your sample is contaminated or someone's playing with CRISPR. We're required to report potential biohazard materials to... I hung up. The third lab didn't call. Instead, I got a visit from David Park, the technician, at my home at 11 p.m. Dr. Holbrook? He was young, maybe 25, nervously looking over his shoulder. I need to talk to you about the sample you submitted. I don't know what you're talking about. The blood sample? Under the name Peterson? I ran the analysis. He pulled out a tablet showing me data I couldn't interpret. These markers, they're impossible. Primate, definitely, but with chromosomal arrangements that suggest either horizontal gene transfer or deliberate engineering. Engineering? Like someone took human DNA and modified it, or like something evolved parallel to humans but picked up genetic material from other sources along the way. I've seen similar patterns in classified samples from... He stopped himself. From where? I can't say. But Dr. Holbrook, if you have more samples, if you have evidence of where this came from, there are people who need to know. People who've been looking for this for a long time. 2 weeks later, those people found me. I was reviewing footage in my office when my wife knocked. Marcus? There's a woman here. Says she's from the government? Agent Rebecca Martinez stood in my living room like she was expecting an attack. Blazer concealing what was probably a weapon, stance keeping her back to a wall, eyes that missed nothing. She held up credentials I couldn't read fast enough before pocketing them. Dr. Holbrook, we need to talk about your recent survey in the Kalmiopsis. I don't. We have your lab submissions. We have reports from Forest Service about unusual structures. We know you encountered something. She pulled out a tablet, showed me a satellite photo of the canyon where I'd shot the creature. Thermal imaging shows you made contact with multiple large primates on October 17th. My mouth went dry. Thermal imaging doesn't penetrate the canopy. Our satellites do. She let that sink in. They'd been watching. They knew. We need all your evidence, she continued. Samples, footage, notes, everything. And if I refuse? National security protocols supersede academic freedom, Doctor. You can cooperate and remain a respected biologist who signed an NDA, or you can resist and become a conspiracy theorist who fabricated evidence for attention. I thought about the creature's eyes, the child's disappointment, the family that had let me leave when they could have killed me. They're intelligent, I said. They have culture, rights. You can't just, they're a potential biological threat that needs to be assessed and contained. Her expression softened slightly. Doctor, I have a background in molecular biology. I understand what you're feeling. But these entities have evaded detection for centuries while developing alongside us. That suggests capabilities we need to understand. Entities? We've had 3 confirmed encounters in the Pacific Northwest. Yours is the most thoroughly documented. She paused. You're also the only one who survived direct contact. That chilled me more than anything else, she bowed, he said. In the end, I gave them everything. What choice did I have? But I kept backups hidden. The body camera, memory card buried in my grandfather's tackle box, blood samples in a friend's freezer labeled as deer blood, photos uploaded to an encrypted cloud server under a fake name. Insurance, I told myself, or evidence for when I finally decided to tell the truth. The investigation lasted 3 months. They took over the Kalmiopsis in November 2019, closing huge sections to public access under the pretense of geological instability from early winter rains. Locals complained, but federal authority trumped everything. Martinez brought me back twice as a consultant. The first time, I showed them where everything had happened. The cave was empty, professionally cleaned. No tools, no bones, no evidence of habitation. Even the bloodstains from my shooting were gone. The soil itself removed down to bedrock. They sanitized it, I said. Or relocated, Martinez replied, making notes on her tablet. The structures you documented are all gone too. Every one of them. They were learning, adapting, hiding better because I'd exposed them. The second time they brought me back was worse. They'd found something. Ranger Tom Winters met us at the trailhead, his face grim. I'd known Tom for years. He was Karuk, indigenous to the area, had grown up on stories about the tall ones his grandmother swore were real. Found it this morning during Sweep 7, he told Martinez, not looking at me. Grid, reference 247. We hiked 6 hours to a natural cave system I hadn't known existed. Inside, wrapped in what looked like cedar bark and covered with stones, was a body. Not human. Not quite. It had been dead for days, maybe a week. Decomposition was advanced, but the structure was clear, 8 feet tall, massive bone structure, the distinctive mid-tarsal break in the feet, and in the left shoulder, a wound that matched a 30-06 entry point. Oh God, I breathed. Congratulations. Doctor, Martinez said coldly. You killed one. But it was what surrounded the body that broke me. Carved wooden items, dozens of them, arranged in deliberate patterns. Food offerings going rotten, and scratched into the cave wall, fresh marks in the stone that looked like attempts at writing, recording something, memorializing. They'd given him a funeral. They'd mourned him. Tissue samples confirm genetic match to your blood evidence, Martinez continued. This is the specimen you shot. Specimen, not person, not individual. Specimen. Tom Winters touched my shoulder. My grandmother would say you freed his spirit, that sometimes death is necessary for truth to emerge. I wanted to believe him, still do. But I know what I really did was murder something that was trying to communicate. The federal investigation ended abruptly in February 2020. One day the teams were there, the next they were gone. The Kalmiopsis reopened to the public with no explanation. Martinez disappeared, her phone disconnected, emails bouncing back. But first, she visited me one last time. It's being classified, she said, handing me a stack of documents. Sign these, forget everything, move on with your life. That's it? They're just going to pretend they don't exist? The decision's been made. Acknowledging them creates more problems than it solves. Land rights, legal status, conservation requirements, military applications. Pandora's box stays closed, but they're out there, they're intelligent, they have rights. They have protection through obscurity. The moment they're officially recognized, they become resources. Genetic resources, military resources, scientific resources. How long do you think they'd survive that? She was right. I hated her for it, but she was right. There's something else, she added. The genetic markers your lab tech mentioned, the ones that seem engineered? He wasn't wrong. These things, they're not entirely natural. Someone or something modified, long ago, but deliberately, modified them. Who? Why? Above my clearance and yours. But doctor, she paused at my door. Stay out of the calmiopsis. They know who you are now. All of them. And we won't be there to intervene next time. I signed the papers, took my enforced leave of absence from the university, went through the motions of normal life while carrying impossible knowledge. But I couldn't stay away. 6 months later, I went back. Not to research or document, just to apologize. To leave supplies at the shelter site. To acknowledge what I'd done. The shelter was still there, rebuilt, improved. Inside, centered on a flat stone, was my grandfather's compass. The brass one I'd left as an offering. They'd kept it, preserved it, and scratched into the stone beside it 3 vertical lines. The same symbol from the wooden carving. From my truck window. I've been back 17 times in 5 years. I never see them, but they see me. Food I leave disappears. Sometimes there are new wooden carvings left behind never for me to take, just to show me they're still creating, still living, still remembering. The wound I caused has scarred over but never healed. For them or for me. So why am I telling you this now, 5 years later, breaking an NDA that could destroy what's left of my career and possibly land me in federal prison? Because 3 weeks ago, someone posted drone footage from the calmiopsis. Shaky, distant, but unmistakable. A figure walking upright through a meadow. Proportions all wrong for human, moving with that distinctive gait I know so well. The video went viral. Bigfoot finally caught on camera. Proof of Sasquatch. Oregon's hidden mystery revealed. And people are heading into the calmiopsis. Dozens of them. Hunters, researchers, tourists, influencers. All looking for their own encounter, their own evidence, their own fame. They don't understand what they're walking into. These aren't animals to be hunted or specimens to be collected. They're people, different people, but people with families, culture, language, and memory. And they remember what happened last time one of us got too close. I've spent 5 years leaving apologies in the forest. 5 years of supplies and offerings and carved wooden responses I can't read. 5 years of an uneasy truce built on mutual avoidance. That truce is breaking. Last week, I found something new at the shelter. Not a carving, not supplies. A stone tool, napped to a killing edge, deliberately placed where my offerings usually go. Beside it, drawn in the dirt, the 3 vertical lines that mark me, but crossed through, negated. The meaning was clear. The amnesty is over. I don't know if the one I shot survived. The body Martinez showed me could have been another, or they could have moved him there after he died. But someone survived to tell the story, to pass down the warning, to remember the human who shot first and asked questions later. Now they're being hunted again, pursued by people who've learned nothing from my mistake, people who see them as monsters or myths or trophies, not as the intelligent beings they are. They were here first. Before European colonization, before indigenous peoples, maybe before Homo sapiens as we know ourselves. They've survived by staying hidden, by avoiding us, by choosing peace over conflict for thousands of years. But everything has a breaking point. I'm breaking my silence because someone needs to know the truth before it's too late. These beings aren't what we think they are. They're not missing links, or evolutionary dead ends, or cryptozoological curiosities. They're survivors of something ancient. Inheritors of modifications we don't understand. Keepers of knowledge we've forgotten. And they've been watching us far longer than we've been looking for them. My grandfather knew. His stories weren't dementia, they were warnings. Inherited wisdom, traditional knowledge that we've dismissed as folklore. They watch us, mark us. Been watching since before we knew to look back. He was right. And now, because of what I did, because of what others are about to do. They might stop watching and start acting. The Kalmiopsis Wilderness covers 180,000 acres of some of the roughest terrain in North America. Valleys that have never seen human footprints, caves, systems that go deeper than we've mapped, old-growth forests where the canopy is so thick that satellites can't penetrate. That's their world, their home, their sanctuary, and we're invading it. I still have the carved wooden piece they left me during my escape. 3 vertical lines that might mean marked, or remembered, or unforgiven. I carry it everywhere now, a reminder of my sin and their intelligence. Sometimes I dream about the one I shot. In the dreams, he speaks perfect English, asking why I was afraid of something different. Why my first response to the unknown was violence. Why humans always shoot first. I never have an answer, but I have a warning for anyone who will listen. Stay out of the Kalmiopsis. What's hidden there has survived by avoiding us. But if we keep pushing, keep hunting, keep trying to expose them, that survival instinct will shift from avoidance to elimination. They're stronger than us, smarter in their environment than us. And now, thanks to me, they know we're a threat. I'm a scientist who shot something that might have been trying to communicate with me. I'll carry that weight forever. The blood under my fingernails that won't wash clean. The sound of pain that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. The eyes that showed intelligence and confusion as I raised the rifle. But I'm more afraid of what happens when someone else makes the same mistake, and the creatures decide we're no longer worth avoiding. The Kalmiopsis keeps its secrets. It has for thousands of years. Some secrets are meant to stay hidden. Some knowledge comes at too high a price, and some boundaries, once crossed, can never be restored. They're out there, watching, waiting, remembering. The 3 vertical lines are a warning, a mark, a memory, and possibly a countdown. Marcus Holbrook disappeared on the 3rd of November 2024 during his 18th return trip to the Kalmiopsis Wilderness. His vehicle was found at the trailhead, keys in the ignition, his grandfather's rifle left on the seat. Search and rescue operations found no trace of him despite a 2-week effort. The only unusual discovery was a carefully placed pile of stones at his usual campsite, arranged in 3 vertical lines. This account was found on his home computer, scheduled to auto-publish if he didn't return. The Kalmiopsis Wilderness remains open to the public. Hikers are advised to stay on marked trails and report any unusual sightings to park rangers. 12 people have gone missing in the area since the drone footage was released. The 3 vertical lines have been found at each disappearance site,